Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 11 of the Spoken Greats podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a look at The Black Swan again by Nassim Taleb. And specifically, we're going to be looking at strategies for dealing with the Black Swan. So how can we mitigate and put in place contingencies against unpredictable events, but also take advantage of unpredictable events when they do occur? Because unpredictable events aren't just negative, they do have some upside sometimes. Today I shall be drinking a Carmen Fume Blanc from 2022. So Fume Blanc, if you're not aware, is basically a Sauvignon Blanc which has been aged in a barrel. So if you're quite keen on your New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc from somewhere like Marlborough, or maybe you like a Sancerre from France, usually it will be aged in a steel vat, which is basically an inert vessel, so it doesn't alter the characteristics of the wine. And so what you're left with is a zesty, crisp, dry, typically wet grass, kind of grapefruit taste to it. However, so Fume Blanc came about in the 70s in the US, where Sauvignon Blanc had a bit of a bad rep. And some winemakers in California wanted to improve that reputation by a little bit of creative rebranding. And they wanted to see if they could make something a little bit more interesting with some oak aging. And so they applied the name Blanc, meaning white, obviously, and Fume, meaning smoked, inspired by the French appellation Pouilly Fumé, which also uses Sauvignon Blanc, but is not typically oaked. So what you're left with is something with a little bit more complexity. It's a bit more off-dry. It's more wet stone fruit than a typical Sauvignon Blanc. So let's give this a whiff. It gets a bit more of a tropical fruit smell to this. Let's give it a taste. Cheers. Yes, probably like passion fruit, maybe passion fruit or pineapple kind of taste to it. My mouth is frothing with saliva, so it's incredibly acidic. It is off-dry and has a little bit of I would say a more fuller body than your typical Sauvignon Blanc. I found it was more of a much richer viscosity, which is what you'd expect from aging in the oak barrel. That gives it a little bit more of a cream-like texture. This would be fantastic with some salmon. I had a glass of this the other night with a Bulgarian salad and it went down fantastic. Yeah, so absolutely would recommend that again. I can't even remember where I bought this from. I think I found it in Lidl. Could be wrong. Please let me know if you find it in your supermarket somewhere. Please let me know what you'll be drinking in the comments. And let's get started with some lessons from the Black Swan. So for the benefit of the people who haven't heard the previous podcast, a Black Swan is an unpredictable event with huge consequences which were unforeseen. Now, this can lie into two forms because you can have a negative Black Swan. So this could be a pandemic, it could be a terrorist attack, a war, it could be a financial crisis. And then you have positive Black Swans. So this could be a business venture succeeding. It could be being presented with an unexpected opportunity, or you go viral, for example. These kind of things you can't predict, but you can still benefit from them. So once you've established that there are different types of Black Swans, it's important to know which ones you're currently being exposed to. Certain professions are more likely to lean towards negative Black Swans, and others are more likely to lean towards positive Black Swans. And in the case of ones which lean towards negative Black Swans, there will be a likely fixed payoff. So there will be a fixed amount that you can benefit, but the amount that you can lose is total. You could have a total loss. So in the military, for example, what you don't know will probably kill you. It's not good to have surprises in the military. And the same goes if you work in law enforcement or security services, intelligence agencies, whatever. Famously, the IRA tried to kill Margaret Thatcher and most of the British government in the 80s in the Brighton Hotel bombing, and it only narrowly failed as the blast destroyed the bathroom but not the bedroom that Margaret Thatcher was staying in. And the IRA famously released a statement afterwards saying, "Today we were unlucky, but remember, we only have to be lucky once. You have to be lucky every time." And this is the challenge in the security sector when dealing with something like counterterrorism. Very little credit for getting things right and all the blame if things go wrong. And so surprises or black swans in a security setting are almost always a big downside. Similarly, in the finance sector, if you are a moneylender, your gains are fixed at the pre-agreed interest rates tied to the loan. So you have a fixed upside. You'll get the money you gave back plus a bit of interest. If the person you gave the money to goes on to do extremely well, they're not going to pay back any more than what they've already agreed to. So you won't receive any of the benefits of that. However, you receive all of the risks. If they default on their loan, then you lose 100% of the money that you gave to them. So finance, another example where you're exposed to huge downsides with a limited upside. At the other end of the scale is things in the creative domain, so singers or artists, film productions, for example. At the lower end, with a small financial investment in creative work, you have a fixed downside. You could lose whatever that amount is, whereas the upside is potentially infinite. You could produce a bestseller. Your song could be number one. You could produce a cult classic movie. So in these ones, your losses are known in advance. You know, in all probability, it won't work, but you only need to be lucky once, and then all the times that you weren't lucky, it cancels that out and more than pays for itself. Let's say you put 5% of your income into emerging biotech companies researching, cures for cancer or Alzheimer's. Most of those go bust. Most of those fail. You've got between about a 5 and 15% chance of that company still being around in 5 years. However, if they do fail, you know that your loss is fixed at 5% or whatever percent of your money you invested it in. But the upside is potentially so huge of being a stakeholder in a company from its early beginnings has the potential to pay off in the thousands of percents of return. It produces a disproportionate payoff. That would be a positive black swan. Now, many people confuse this strategy as buying enough lottery tickets in the hope that one of them pays off. But the lottery is the wrong analogy because the lottery has fixed probability odds, whereas black swan events do not. You can't compute a black swan, and therefore your odds can actually be better. Further to that, a lottery jackpot has a fixed payout and has specific algorithms which determine how something is picked, which actually makes it much less likely that you would win the lottery than you would benefit from a black swan. So the next lesson is to avoid being too precise or too local. As we've talked about before, that we can't really predict black swans, the next best thing we can do is expose ourselves to a variety of different things. And this kind of builds in contingencies. If you think about mixed martial arts, the best fighters have a range of capabilities which they're able to use. They can grapple, they can strike, they have endurance, they have strength. If you're a world-class boxer, but you've never been put on your back before, or you're a jiu-jitsu black belt, but you've never taken a punch before, then your entire strategy has relied on one outcome going the way that you've trained for. And if it doesn't go that way, you have no redundancy in place. You have no contingency. Militaries have this as well. With planning for wars, they have to be prepared to fight a variety of different wars, a counterinsurgency, a large-scale war, or an amphibious invasion. When you can't predict, the next best thing you can do is prepare. So the next lesson is about exposing yourself to opportunities and seizing them when they present themselves. I think this is something which many people fail to realize, is that yes, people become successful because of luck, but everyone at some point will be presented with good luck or bad luck. What differentiates people is how they respond to luck when presented with it. Do they make the most of good luck when presented to them? And do they mitigate bad luck as much as possible? If you happen to be in a Black Swan domain, such as a creative, for example, the place to maximize your chances of luck is a large city. London has a population of 8 million, which means that events which have a 1 in a million chance of happening happen 8 times per day. This could be from chance encounters on public transport, or striking up a conversation with someone in a coffee shop, or talking to someone at a cocktail party, or going to a conference. In most cases, it won't get you anywhere, but you've little to lose from it, and the upside is potentially limitless. You could strike up a conversation with someone who could lead to your next job opportunity. You just don't know. And this is the power of large networks. It increases your exposure to luck disproportionately. It can often be informal social ties which lead to more opportunities than going through formal channels. When, for example, you send a cold email to someone, or you send a formal application, versus you socializing with someone, they've already established you're a pretty decent person, and you're able to connect with that person without going through the usual gatekeepers like receptionists or assistants that you'd normally have to go through if you went through the formal channels. Equally, you could be a researcher and you could strike up a conversation with someone at a party, and they could have a unique perspective on something which you've never considered before. And who knows, that could take your research in a totally different direction. And that never would have occurred before if you just stayed at home. And so your exposure to positive black swans is so much higher in population dense areas than they would be in like a rural area. If you stayed in the countryside, the odds of finding someone in your domain which could give you the next opportunity, unless you're a farmer, much lower. Of course they are. Because the sample size of the population you're dealing with is so much smaller. And when you have something which relies on a low odds of happening, you need a large population set to increase the odds of that happening. The internet is an interesting example in that, because to a certain extent, it can nullify the effects of being in a low population area, because you're exposed to the billions of users on different websites. YouTube could be a great example of that, where people have the opportunity to potentially develop a following in different areas of the world, which they never before would have been linked to. I've not that far into this journey of starting a YouTube channel, and already I look at the stats and I see there's people from places like the Philippines or India or Hungary, and I never would have imagined trying to reach out to those people. Whereas the internet has leveled that playing field. It's made my location irrelevant to reach out to a global audience. In fact, a YouTube channel is a great example of a positive black swan, because the biggest loss I have effectively is my time. My potential upside is that I develop a large enough audience to do this full time. My losses are capped at the time I've spent on making videos and the equipment that I've bought. That's it. I'm not going to declare bankruptcy if this YouTube channel doesn't go any further. So the next lesson talks about consequences. In the previous podcast, I talked about the example of Russian roulette and impact versus probability, where it doesn't matter how many times you win Russian roulette. If you lose once, you blow your brains out. The overarching lesson that Taleb tries to give in the Black Swan is to maximize your exposure to positive consequences and avoid negative ones. So in this part of the book, he talks about Pascal's wager, but not in the way that you think it would, because Blaise Pascal is famous for Pascal's wager, the idea that it's in your interest to believe in a god, even if there isn't one, because if there is no God, then you've lost nothing, but you gain eternal life if it does exist. Whereas if you're right about there being no God, then you gain nothing, and if you're wrong, you potentially get sent to hell. Now, I'm not going to get drawn into a theological debate. Taleb also points out some flaws in Pascal's argument, but he makes the argument that Pascal's wager applies much better to other walks of life. When you cannot compute the probability of something, instead look at the consequences. I don't know what the odds are of me drowning, probably quite low spread across the population, but investing a couple of hours in learning how to swim means that if I do fall in the lake or something, I can at least swim enough to not die. And if I never have to use that, the downside is I've lost a couple of hours. Inversely, if I don't learn how to swim, the upside is I've saved a couple of hours, and the downside is that if I do fall into a body of water, I may panic and drown. So that's an example where, inversely, the upside is extremely small and the downside is incredibly huge. Texting while driving, by the way, is a great example of this. A low reward, high risk activity. Best case scenario, you check your phone whilst you're driving, someone sends you a funny text. Worst case scenario, you crash your car and die. Now, the probability of that is irrelevant. It doesn't matter how many times you've checked your phone whilst driving and haven't crashed. It only takes one time for it to happen, and then all the other times that it didn't happen is irrelevant, because the consequences are more severe than the probability. This is where we can get lulled into a false sense of security, where if something hasn't happened to us before, then we don't believe it will happen to us in the future. Famously, a couple of years before the voyage on the Titanic, the captain declared that he'd never, in his long career of 30 plus years, he'd never seen or been involved in any kind of maritime accident or safety failure. And so clearly when it came round to getting on the Titanic, he was confident that the voyage would encounter no difficulties. Consider what the best case scenario and worst case scenarios of any actions are, not what the average is. When you're crossing a river, it doesn't matter what the average depth is. What's important is the maximum depth. If the average depth is 1 meter, you may think, this is great, this is easy enough to cross. If the maximum depth is 3 meters, then that drastically changes the calculus, doesn't it? Similarly, if you were going to travel to a place, you shouldn't look at the average temperature, you should look at the variance. What is the maximum temperature and the minimum temperature that it could be? Looking at the average doesn't consider the worst case scenario. If you were to average out the temperature of Russia over the course of a year, you'd get an average of 19. What that wouldn't prepare you for is minus 20 in winter or as high as 35 to 40 in the summer. If you'd come along wearing clothes only for 19 degrees, you're going to freeze to death. So here are some quick fire lessons from Nassim Taleb. Number 1, have respect for time and non-demonstrative knowledge. So this is in relation to favouring things which have been around a long time. This relates to the Lindy effect, where the non-perishable things such as ideas, concepts, technology, the length of time that they have existed for is the same amount as how likely they are to survive into the future. So if a book has been around for 10 years, it's likely to be popular for another 10 years. If it's lasted 200 years, it's likely to still be used for another 200 years. This is the danger with falling for the recent trends and stuff that's come out in like the past few months. Most of the time, we totally forget those. Have you ever looked back at those annual reviews of the year and then you realize, oh shit, yeah, what was that meme everyone was talking about in January that we've all totally forgotten about now? Or that business that suddenly everyone was rushing to buy shares in and has now gone bankrupt in the course of 6 months to a year. The less time that something has been around, the less likely it is to continue. And the inverse is true. I sometimes take this strategy with books. So I tend to read books which are at least a decade old. With literature, I tend to read stuff that's best part of 50 plus years old because it stood the test of time. And different generations with different values have still found value in the same piece of work. Whereas something written specifically for our time has the potential to just fall into obscurity. You can outsource a lot of your reading habits to time. Look at what people carry on using or still read. And when it comes to an industry, if something has been around a long time, you know that it's had to deal with uncertainty. It's been exposed to fragility and catastrophic events. So the next one is avoid optimization, learn to love redundancy. So I talked a little bit about this with giving the example of an MMA fighter learning different skills or a military having different capabilities. If you are a specialist with no other skills, you've put all your eggs in one basket and it may prove profitable. It very often does. However, whatever the probability is, and remember, we can't compute probability, even though we think we can, of that industry collapsing, means that you're incredibly vulnerable. So by taking up a second occupation, let's say you get a part-time job in a different industry, a totally different industry, your exposure to risk has been lowered so much because now you have redundancy in place. Is it the most optimal for getting the most out of a single career stream? No, it isn't. However, what it is an insurance policy, a safety net, in case one of those industries collapses or goes through a difficult time and opportunities freeze up. You're exposing yourself to more positive and you're mitigating the impact of any potential negatives. And if you pick two very different industries, the likelihood of them both going through a period of mass redundancies at the same time is lower than one of them. He also advocates for having a good amount of cash savings. Is this the most optimal thing to do with your money in terms of making money? No, it isn't. You see it all the time in finance advice on YouTube or likes of Robert Kiyosaki of investing every dollar you have. The problem with that is that you're exposing all of your dollars to risk. And by having cash savings, you have a redundancy in place, which protects you from the market. In the early days of Microsoft, Bill Gates famously was so cautious about cash reserves to the point that he wanted Microsoft to hold enough cash so that it could afford to pay all of its employees for a year without any more money coming in. Now, that is quite an extreme strategy. It allows for a hell of a lot of headroom in the event of a downward market, a new technology coming out, or a new software company launching which overtakes Microsoft. It gives you room to maneuver. Similarly, when you go into the airport, being there 2 hours before your flight or 3 hours before your flight, it might seem like a waste of time. I normally get through security at this long. There's no point going early. If, however, the effects of missing your flight are more severe than waiting in the airport, for example, there's no more flights that day and it's a really important trip, or you're going to spend hundreds of more pounds on getting another flight, then getting those few extra hours of redundancy is the optimal strategy for risk reduction. It's not the most optimal for being efficient, but risk reduction is not efficient. So avoid over-optimization, over-specialization, or over-efficiency. The next lesson is avoiding prediction of small probability payoffs, though not necessarily of ordinary ones. So in the case of ordinary ones, if you're working in a linear business, so this is one which is predictable. Let's say you run a hairdresser's or a bakery. You can project your profits quite reliably. You know what the maxed amount of income is that you can earn because you know the number of hours that the salon is open. You know the maximum number of clients that you can physically serve. That's your maximum revenue number. So you can make a forecast on that. Trying to make a forecast on how many books you're going to sell, however, is a fool's errand. You can't plan your finances around that because, as we've discussed before, this is the realm of black swans. It's small probability, and so you can't factor in your earnings. And Taleb gives the example of the barbell strategy, where you spend most of your money in low risk. So this could be putting it into a savings account. It could be into treasury bonds, and the opposite end, putting money into high risk, high reward ventures. So let's say you put 10% of your money into a startup, and so your losses are capped there at 10%. You're not going to lose all of your money. You're maxed at 10. You could potentially have an infinite amount of gains. And just avoid the medium risk, everything in the middle. Anything that's medium gain, medium risk. And Taleb argues that a lot of things which are classed as medium risk may in fact even be higher risk, aren't worth doing. Generally, a lot of the stock on the stock market would be classed as medium risk, medium reward. So the example of that in playing it out in your life may be where you get a secure job. Let's say you get a standard 9-to-5 corporate job or a job in government that's fairly well paid. And then as a side business, you have something which is a potential high payoff. There, you've secured your future by having a stable job, but you also have the exposure to the potential upside of a business venture coming to fruition. But you've also mitigated yourself against risk because you have that redundancy mechanism in place. Next lesson. Do not confuse absence of volatility with the absence of risk. Humans naturally do not like volatility. We like things to be stable and have low variance, and we can often overcompensate for that accordingly. A doctor may overprescribe medication to mitigate against a variance in mood. A overprotective mother may raise their kids around disinfectant because they don't want them to get sick. But manufacturing this low variance, this low volatility, does not increase the robustness of whatever system it is that you're managing. In fact, it likely increases the vulnerability to a black swan. So in the case of the child, when the child eventually is exposed to a disease, their immune system is likely to be much weaker than the kid who was outside playing in the mud. Similarly, you can see this in dictatorships. Dictatorships have low variance, low volatility. They give the impression of stability until they implode. They seem a lot more stable than democracies. Taleb in the book gives the example of Italy versus Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia looks incredibly orderly from the outside, whereas Italy is like herding cats. You ever seen traffic in Rome? It's a nightmare. So on the face of it, Saudi Arabia appears much more stable than Italy because there's low volatility, there's less variance. However, if something were to happen to the Italian Prime Minister, some sort of terrorist attack or natural disaster or health episode, in all likelihood, Italy would be fine and carry on because its political system is a lot more robust. You can't say the same if something were to happen to the Saudi royal family. The potential chaos in Saudi Arabia would be immense. And you see that playing out across the Middle East in places like Libya or Iraq, where the illusion of stability under characters such as Muammar Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein meant that these systems had low volatility. So on the face of it, Libya and Iraq appeared to be countries which were incredibly robust because they were stable and had low volatility. It was orderly, authoritarian. And we tend to conflate the two. Authoritarianism does not mean that a system is robust, because if a system is truly robust, it can deal with the removal of a leader or several individuals and still carry on. So a system that is dependent on institutions is far more robust than a system which is dependent on personalities. You can look at this in a similar light when looking at companies. So Warren Buffett gives the advice on investing in a company that's so simple that an idiot could run it, because one day an idiot will run it. And so if you have an incredibly successful business that is purely dependent on one personality, it may produce a very profitable return. But as soon as anything happens to that person, the entire thing collapses, in which case there's low volatility, but very weak robustness. And it's often difficult to justify volatility to people because we naturally don't like it. And in a lot of the examples where we've looked at where they have a potential high payoff, they are volatile domains. So most of the time they do not pay off. And we are naturally averse to loss. We don't like to lose. So even if we are losing very small amounts, which we can sustain and we can recover from, we are naturally averse to that. And if we see a domain isn't working out, for example, let's say someone's a creative, it's very difficult to justify to your family and friends what it is you're doing if it's not producing any results. This is why creative people often have to be, to a certain extent, a little bit irrational, because they have to fight conventional thinking and defy the odds. And they also have to be desensitized to consistent setbacks or no results from the work that they're inputting, versus something which may have an immediate payoff could be exposed to a lot more risk. The final point, Taleb advocates that investments for the average person should only be something for entertaining. Just like gambling, going to a casino, or putting a bet on a horse is a bit of fun. You should not expect to walk away with more money than what you put in with at the first place, which means that whatever money you put in, you should expect to lose or be prepared to lose. If you can't afford to lose that money, don't put it in. Because there's a tendency to follow financial authorities who speak with such conviction and certainty on the outcomes of markets. And the reality is no one has a clue. And misplacing your faith in those people can lead to disastrous outcomes. Taleb argues that people would be better placed spending that money on something within their control, such as starting their own business. At least then, any stress from losing the money is related to something within your control. You can control to a certain extent what your business does and how it performs. You can't control how the market will react to something, which is the case with investments, especially if they're something more indirect. And also by potentially starting a business, you have the potential to capitalize on your expertise, on things that you know things about. And so you're better off starting a cake business on the side in addition to your day job, because at least you know something about baking cakes, whereas you likely know nothing about Forex trading or venture capital. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you for listening to the Spoken Greats podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and hit the subscribe button. Be sure to check out my blog at spokengreats.com and look forward to future episodes with more great ideas from great books. See you soon.